I bought this tractor 2 years ago, partially because I always wanted a tractor. As a kid, I grew up on a farm and we had tractors. And for 35 years, I didn't have access to a tractor. And so I finally bought myself one. But it turned out to be a big mistake because now that we're moving, I decided to sell this tractor. And I sold it for $7,000, which is less than half of what I paid for it because it had a whole bunch of things wrong with it that I didn't know about, that the seller did not mention to me and put on the bill of sale as is. I was wondering why he did that. Now I know why. So I thought I'd go over this tractor one last time, showing some of the things that are wrong with it that I didn't know about, that the people, various farmers that looked at it to buy it, spotted on here, which is what drove the price down so far. So hopefully that'll be a lesson to you if you're thinking of buying a tractor. Also, it's way too much tractor. I read online you can never have too much tractor, but this tractor, the size is handy for some things, but it turned out it was actually too much tractor. Some of the things wrong with this tractor, the front end loader, this pin here, you can see there's a big gap on this side. It has way too much play both on this part and on the inside part. Maybe the pin in here is just too small. I'm not sure. It hasn't really affected my using the front end loader, but it's definitely something that is not ideal and at the very least costs some money to fix. A more serious problem is the power shift transmission. So you have a gear shift here. Let's put that into neutral, and that gear shift has 1, 2, 3 and reverse, and then there's the power shift here which gives you 4 speeds in each of those. But it turns out this doesn't actually switch into the 4th one. It goes, I think, in the 3rd one and in the 1st one. So the problem with that is that has a linkage that goes down into this gearbox here, and to really have a look at that, I think you need to split the tractor in 2, which means if this turns out to be something somebody has to work on, they have to undo the bolts potentially right here and split the tractor into 2 halves, which of course takes some sort of heavy equipment at least to hold the 2 parts, and then mating them back together is tricky. And also it means removing the whole frame for the front end loader, because the front end loader ties to the front half and to the back axle. Although I just realized now, actually this gearbox, there's a set of bolts here, so potentially this cover can come off without splitting the whole tractor, which means it might be not as bad, but still, it's a rather daunting prospect to get at the transmission on a tractor. Although it's not like it's easy to get at on a car or a pickup truck either, because you pretty much have to take the engine out. And the next daunting problem is there is a PTO, and the PTO is engaged using this clutch and using this gear shift lever on the back. So the clutch here is used to slowly engage the PTO when the engine is running, because if you have something like a baler, for instance, on there that has a huge flywheel, you can't just shift it in gear. That would just wreck things. You put it in gear and then slowly engage the clutch here, but that seems to be stuck on, which means for some things, if it was just for instance a post hole digger auger, you could probably get away with just engaging the PTO using this gear shift lever here. Right now it's in neutral, which means I can freely spin this down here, and if I click it back, it's engaged. So now it's essentially coupled to the engine. One guy who looked at it said, "Oh yeah, I've got a tractor with the same problem. I just have to shut the engine off before I turn the bush hog on." I guess that works for a bush hog still too, but something much bigger, probably not. The other things wrong with it are relatively minor. It's missing the guard for the PTO here. When the 3-point hitch goes up and down, it actually makes a bit of a whining noise, which is not ideal. Other things, the electrical is probably not in ideal shape. If you look in here, there is a set of wires that just sort of ends that was cut off. So I don't know to what extent these lights work. Certainly they have different colored lenses on them, and the front lights are missing. That I knew about when I bought it. I mean, that's pretty obvious. Another minor thing is, for some reason, these are wires coming from the battery, these two, and this is negative and this is positive. That's pretty easy to fix. I don't know how that happened. Possibly accident waiting to happen. It took me the longest time to figure that out because it's not positive ground, and this goes to the engine, but it's the red wire. So they just need to be swapped on the battery and on the starter. That's the only place the battery wires go. Then, of course, there's cosmetic issues. It's a bit rusty, and this tractor itself has been repainted at some point, which is, I guess, always a little bit suspicious. And if you look on here, this hub is quite greasy, which suggests that the gearbox in the wheel, that's this thing here, may be leaking some oil. It could also be hydraulic oil coming out of these cylinders. Basically, a little bit of leakage out of hydraulics for an old machine is actually quite normal, but it may be coming out of this gearbox. This is a planetary gearbox that's in the front wheels, and the actual front differential and drive shaft runs much faster than the wheels turn. And I think the reason they did that is so that you don't need as heavy a constant velocity joint in here, because that turns much faster at a lower torque than the wheels actually turn. Now I'll just go over a few other things about this tractor that aren't things that are busted with it, but that I actually found quite interesting, and I've learned a fair bit about tractors just reading up on it. I've often wondered, for instance, this front end loader has two lift cylinders. There's the little one up here and the main one down here. And I've seen that on other machines, like some of those telehandlers. Those are those forklifts with a long boom that you see on construction sites. Some of those seem to have two lift cylinders as well, or two sets of lift cylinders. And it turns out this is not a lift cylinder at all. This cylinder is actually hydraulically in parallel with these cylinders here, which are for tilting the bucket or the fork. And what that does is actually auto leveling. So as the loader, as the main arm is lifted up, this cylinder expands and more fluid can go in here. And since that's connected to the bottom end of this cylinder, that means these cylinders will let down a little bit. So as the whole loader goes up, it automatically lets the tilt down a little bit, so that whatever is on the end here stays level, which is a very useful feature, because forgetting to adjust as you move up and down is actually, that can be a dangerous thing to do, because you may have something on here that will tip off the back as you've got the loader way up and potentially fall into the operator, so that could be dangerous. Now there is a catch with this, and that is, suppose I have the loader up and tilt the bucket all the way back, and then I bring the loader down. Well, it will try to maintain that tilt, but if this is backed up all the way against that, it can't maintain that tilt because the whole loader is tilting down, and it just can't go any further because it hits it here, which means that hydraulic fluid has to go somewhere. If there's nothing to relieve the pressure of that, it would just blow a seal in a cylinder or explode one of the hoses. So there's this thing here, which is a pressure relief valve, which if the pressure in the cylinders gets too large, just releases it and lets it back into the oil tank. And that way, if you have for instance, the bucket tilted all the way back and you bring the loader down and it hits on here, that lets the pressure out. Or if you've got it all the way down and you raise it, you run into the same sort of thing. Now, during normal operation, you almost never hit that, because typically you're picking up on the ground with a bucket and you tilt it back and then you bring it up, as opposed to bringing it up, tilting it back, and then bringing it down. But when this does engage, and I've never actually heard this noise until some of the people checking this tractor out actually went through that sort of motion. This makes a bit of a buzzing noise as it relieves the pressure, but that's a heck of a lot better than having some hose explode. Oh yeah, and some of these hoses are in a little bit rough shape too. Now, this tractor is from 1984, which is before a lot of emission regulations for cars kicked in. I don't know when they kicked in for tractors. And that means this is an old style simple engine. It has a mechanical injection pump, Being a diesel engine, diesel engines have always been injection, in that they inject the fuel at around top dead center of the stroke, and the fuel auto-ignites as soon as it's injected because the air is very hot from the compression. So instead of having a spark plug, you just inject the fuel and it burns immediately. And there's 4 pipes that go off into the injectors, and this is the mechanical injection pump, and when you hit the throttle, that hits control on here for the injection pump. And once this engine runs, basically all it needs is the injection pump. It needs no electricity at all, which means I can basically turn the electrical system off and the engine keeps running, and the way to stop the engine is to pull this thing here, and that cuts fuel. Once there's no fuel, the engine stops. Another interesting thing about tractors, for those not familiar, is that you can configure them for a different width of wheelbase, both on the front and back, to essentially give it a wider stance potentially, or a narrow stance, depending on what you do. The wider the stance, of course, the more likely you're going to hit something, but it's much less likely to tip to the side. And the way you do that is, this wheel consists of the inner flange that's completely separate from the rim, and those are bolted together. So this flange can bolt on this side or this side of the rims. These things are not in the center of the rims, so the rims can be swapped left and right to essentially move these flanges in and out. So that's 4 configurations, and then this flange here offsets from here further in here, so this flange can be put on this way or the other way around. So there's 4 different things that can be flipped around, which essentially gives you 8 different potential configurations for how far out the wheels come. Although not all configurations are possible, because, for instance, if we now move the flange to be here, that would move the wheels in by about this much, and then they would touch the fender here. So at least one configuration is not possible. The front wheels also have a similar sort of deal, where you've got the flange that can be reversed, and you've got you can bolt the flange on this side or on the other side, and of course you could swap the front tires left or right to move that flange. So again, 8 possible configurations of how wide the front wheelbase is. Now I'll go over some of the controls on the tractor, because I think for non-farmers, and I'm not a farmer, it's kind of interesting what all of these will do. So this is the PTO clutch, which is stuck on. This is the handbrake, which works perfectly. This lever engages the front wheel drive, so if it's forward, front wheel drive is off. If it's back, the front wheel drive is on. You usually drive with the front wheel drive off, just because that causes more friction on the tires and everything, because there's no front rear differential. But if you're driving on a soft field and pulling something or picking stuff up with a loader, you'd want that on. Basically anytime you really need a lot of pulling or pushing power. There is the brake pedal here, and there's a little bar here that can be disengaged so that the left and the right tires can be braked individually, and that can be useful if this tire or this tire is slipping. You can just brake that tire to kind of even things out. Although if you really run into problems, you can also lock the differential, and I think that's this pedal here. But you don't want to leave that locked, because then if you want to take a turn, you're essentially skidding one of the wheels, because, well, if that differential is locked, not so good. So probably just to touch one of the brakes when sometimes you run into trouble is a better approach. This here is the gas pedal. Perhaps a bit of a misnomer, because it doesn't turn on more gas or anything. It just tells the injection pump to insert more fuel. There's no throttle on a diesel engine. Basically, the cylinders always get a full gulp of air, so to say. And when you push on the gas, that just makes it inject more diesel. That's actually a bit of a problem in terms of emissions, because it turns out having a lean ignition in the cylinder at high compression and high heat tends to create nitrous oxides, and that's the circumstances under which diesel engines always run, which is part of the problem with diesel engines. It's very hard to control the emissions, and one solution to make it acceptable to consumer is to cheat like Volkswagen did, but that can lead to scandals down the road, of course. This tractor doesn't have this problem, because at the time that this was made, there wasn't any such emissions rules, so it just emits lots of nitrous oxides. Now, given how much I've used it, it doesn't really matter, because I've only ever used 1 tank of diesel on this tractor in the 2 years that I've had it, because the fact is I didn't really need a tractor, I just wanted one. Oh, and that reminds me, another thing on this tractor that doesn't work, it turns out, is the hour meter. I never really paid much attention to it, but just as I was getting to sell it, I was using it for an hour straight, so I kept my eye on it, and it didn't move, so that hour count, not accurate. I have no idea what it is. So there's the pedal here for just for driving it around, but if you're tilling the fields or something like that, tractors always have a hand throttle as well, which is basically, this one is pretty stiff, but that essentially pushes the throttle up regardless, because if you're driving in the fields, you don't want to constantly do this, and tractors like this tend to have a governor on it, so you essentially set the RPM that you want it to run at, and it will give it more throttle as the RPM drops, which is a very useful feature if you're, for instance, also just using it as an engine to power things off of the PTO stationary. You don't want to have to go on the tractor and give it more gas as you get more load on there. And then this is the clutch, so actually very similar configuration as in a car. Clutch left, brake on the right, gas down here, fuel shut off here for turning off the tractor. The ignition key here, well, not really ignition because it doesn't fire electrically, but turning that to the right turns on the starter, and on the left turns off the electrical. I actually drained the battery on it a couple of times because you shut it off with this, and I forgot to turn the key off, which left the electrical system on, and then not using the tractor for a few days, it drained the battery. Now, more controls. The gear shift here. This has actually got a fair bit of play in it, so here's in 1, and then to put that into neutral, if I just pull it back, I'm now in 3rd, and it takes a bit of finesse to get it into neutral. A lot of times I'm shifting from reverse to 2nd, so that's pretty easy. I go like this and then like that to go into 2nd, and to go from 2nd to 1st, I just pull it diagonally, and that goes like that. But if I want to go, for instance, from 1 to reverse, I have to be very careful not to go too far. Now I'm already in 3rd, but now I can just go like this to go into reverse. It's just, there's a lot of play on here. It is a little bit easier to manipulate this when it's running. Then back here we have controls for the hydraulics. First one of these is this little guy, and that's a diverter. If I pull this up, that sends half the hydraulic to the 3-point hitch and half to the loader, which means the loader is much slower at that point, but the 3-point hitch works. If I push it down, that sends all the hydraulics to the loader, which is, I've only ever used it with the loader, so I always have this down, and then I get more speed on the loader, especially because I'm usually running the engine at about idle RPM while I'm using the loader, so I appreciate having more fluid going into the loader for operating these controls. Whoops. So even though it's off right now, if I lift that up a little bit, that drops the loader down. When I park it, I always depressurize it, but I just pulled it out right now and there's still pressure in the cylinders. You ideally want all that stuff depressurized just in case there's something that's prone to leak, to let all the cylinders relax to where they need to go so that there's no remaining pressure in the hydraulics. Now, I think it's this lever that's for the draft control on the 3-point hitch, which is very important if you are using this tractor for plowing. That controls how far up the 3-point hitch is, and it also has this feature where I think if something pushes on the top link that goes on here, if that pushes in, that lets go of the hydraulics, so that if you're plowing and you hit a big rock with it or some stump, that lets the plow up automatically as soon as it senses that something is pushing up on the plow. It's also a very useful safety feature, apparently, when they invented that. That was invented by Massey Ferguson, and starting in the 1950s, most tractors started coming with 3-point hitches. An advantage of a 3-point hitch is that you've got a semi-rigid linkage to what you've got on the back, so that you could have something like a bush hog or anything else that isn't too big. You essentially have it loaded onto the tractor, and so when you're done with it, you can just use a 3-point hitch to pick the whole thing up and drive away, and then you get to the next field and again you can drop it down, so that whatever implement you've got doesn't need to have its own wheels. Or if you're plowing, having a rigid linkage between the tractor and the plow is also very useful, because the plow pulls down, and rather than having the plow having its own wheels to take up that load, it's much better to actually pull down on the tractor wheels, because then you get so much more traction, and that way you're much less likely to slip. Now, farmers don't do as much plowing as they used to. Plowing is essentially a method of weed control. You turn the sod upside down so that whatever's growing is buried, and then you plant on the soil that just got exposed to give what you're planting a head start. But nowadays, with Roundup and other kind of chemicals, a lot of farmers will do no-till agriculture, where weed control is done via chemicals instead of by plowing. Now, of course, that means you get more chemicals, which is bad, but plowing is actually also very bad for the soil. It can lead to more erosion and such. And I suspect long-term loss of soil is worse than chemicals in the soil, because the chemicals will eventually wash out, but if the soil washed away, it's gone. Now back to here, there are these 4 hose couplings, and those are essentially 2 remotes. You could hook up a hydraulic cylinder between those 2 so that it can push and pull, and another one to those 2. And that is very important for modern farm machinery. Back in the 70s, when my dad was a farmer, any sort of machine, for instance, there'd be a hay turning machine that has 6 rotors on it, and you towed it into the field and it was folded up. Then you get off the tractor and you unfold it manually, and then you get back on the tractor and you run it. Well, nowadays, the machines have gotten so much bigger that it's not really practical to do that manually. And so they have hydraulic cylinders on them to unfold and fold them up again. So when you hitch up the machine, you connect these 2, and then you can use these levers here to go back and forth, and that will send hydraulic fluid into this one or into this one, which allows you to operate the hydraulic cylinder to unfold the machine. And it's got 2 of these because some machines you also might want to have something to adjust it with, and that seems like 2 of those. Well, on a lot of modern tractors you would have 4 of what is called remotes, so that you'd have 4 channels on here to control 4 separate hydraulic cylinders to control adjustments on the implement that you're towing, because all that stuff is done from the operator from the tractor, as opposed to having to get off and make adjustments, which speed things up a lot, because there's far fewer farmers than there were in the 70s, and so you have to be efficient about it. So the farmers nowadays, you would drive to the field and deploy it while sitting on the tractor, and then immediately start using it. So, well, this is my tractor mistake, essentially. I don't really regret having bought it. I perhaps regret having paid too much for it. And if you compare it to a midlife crisis sports car purchase, well, I lost $9,000 on this tractor. The guy who bought it, I told him all the things that I found wrong with it, and it is priced accordingly. Fixing some of those things can get expensive. If everything was in good shape, would be worth at least $16,000, which is what I paid for it. So he's got quite a bit of margin, or shall we say money, to spend to get full value out of this tractor. And well, it ends up being my money because I lost that money. It's just I was a fool paying too much for this tractor and not knowing fully how to check it over. And people who would buy this size of tractors, aside from fools like me, are all farmers, and I've had quite a few of them look over this tractor and then decide not to buy it. But just getting into conversations with them, farmers are just the most interesting people, because to be successful at a farmer, you have to be hardworking, you have to know your machinery, and you have to be a good businessman. And that just makes farmers the most interesting people, and they all have great stories. It kind of makes me wish I was in a business where I was dealing with farmers, other than trying to sell them a flawed tractor.